Let's start with the song called Ordinary Days.
Beat down, running on empty. Through my restless head comes a melody. It comes rushing to meet me through the little cracks in my memory. It's in those ordinary days that blind you. It's in those ordinary days I find you. Pent up, fear and rejection. In a stranger's eyes, I see my reflection. No love without connection. Let our hearts combine, be your rhythm section. It's in those ordinary days that blind you. It's in those ordinary days I find you. Now I'm spinning in my chair, with the sand related, present and aware, my path illuminated. It's in those ordinary days, in the most extraordinary ways. It's in those ordinary days I find you.
So in the last few days, I have been very captivated by the dilemma that the world is engaged in. And I'm actually been drawn to think a great deal about HIV/AIDS parallel that is very noticeable for those who were in my age group in terms of our anxiety about what COVID-19 is bringing to us, anticipation that there may be 2 or 3 million deaths. And that seems terrifyingly complicated. But from my vantage point, when we lost 30 million people as a result of HIV, and even to this day, there's 36 million people suffering from HIV, it seems to me that there's something going on in the world right at present that is really pretty remarkable, that there is actually a worldwide attempt to collaborate around something or other that normally we would not be able to put our heads around. I know from my own experience, both with HIV and with that one illness story, that I think illness actually gives us an opportunity to pause and think and reflect. My personal one was that at the time, goes back several decades, period when we had young children, actually twins were born and Sarah was pregnant with our third. My mother had died and I hadn't been back to Australia for some time. My father was in deep decline, and actually on this particular occasion was the last time he actually was able to recognize me. In between, the family home had actually been sold. So in the midst of all of that, I have this hidden kidney crisis that required being hospitalized. But I was really touched by the nature of the care, because what was said to me was just simply, look, your life is on overload. This illness is about slowing down. And perhaps if you will just lie down for a couple of days and drink buckets and buckets of water, you'll be absolutely fine, which is actually what happened for me. And I think in that period, I began to appreciate that the concept of illness is very different than most of us really think about, because in a way, we are always ill and we're always healing. if we think about the ways in which our body reproduce themselves all the time, 98% of the cells bodies that we have right at present will die in the coming year. So if we would all gather, a huge community of us were to gather on this day next year, only 2% of us would show up. The other 98% will be dead. Well, that means that death and life at the cellular level is going on constantly. We get a new skeleton every few months. We get new skin every month or so. We get new stomach lining every few days. Going back to that issue of what do we see our permanence. We don't actually see the fluidity with which we are constantly in the streams that we're constantly engaged in. Energies are coming into us every day, and energies are going out of us every single day. And often we try to fight against things like diseases and don't recognize that these diseases are actually a normal part of our beingness. For example, often we'll think about cancer as being an invading force and we have to fight against the cancer and so on. But the reality is that we have cancer cells, about 80 cancer cells develop in our body every single day. But at the same time, we have other cells that are there to try to control that and keep that in balance. So that most of the issues of healing and illness are around the same theme of the yin yang that we were talking about last week and the issue of balance in general. And so I've been thinking about, gee, what a strange gift that COVID may be actually giving to the whole universe right at present. Is this an invitation to us to actually pause and think seriously about what life is about? Is this going to be an occasion when we can actually perhaps do some recalibration? You've read, of course, in the introduction to this book, that I think that we are in the middle of a renaissance yet to be named. I think it started around about 1905 is when I pin it for myself, which is when Einstein came up with the theory of relativity. And I think we're plumb in the middle of it right at present. I've been saying for years now that I think that this particular epoch that we're in is going to be transformative in a form that will require us to go through some very profound changes. I don't think most of us like the changes that we may be about to face, but it is conceivable from my vantage point at least, that a lot of these changes will actually be enormously valuable to us if perchance we can put our head around it. I, at the end of the book, talk about the claim that Gandhi made, that he was not concerned just simply getting rid of colonialism in a political sense, but to also engage in the decolonization of the mind. And so in a way, what I want to do is to suggest that this could be a moment that many of us, and I personally have decided I'm going to choose this moment for myself, to use this time, whatever this time happens to be a matter of weeks or months or years, I'm going to use this time to start working on the issue of the decolonization of the mind. But I don't think it's just the decolonization of the mind. I think it also includes of the heart and of the body and of the spirit as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about this with you this evening. What I'm going to do is focus upon three general themes. The first one will be on economics. The second will be on environment. The third one will be on the overall human condition, our own psyches, right through the society in which we live. And then at the very end, I want to make some comments about how much I think the world is shaping us and how much we are shaping the world. And that there's a new kind of partnership that humanity needs to engage both among ourselves and with the environs in which we live. So that's what I plan to do. And let me just pause by saying a few things now about economics. I've mentioned previously that I have found the man-made economics, that human-made economics, to be remarkably valuable, but also to be remarkably limiting in certain ways. I do think that if you really look at the history of economics, it has made a huge contribution to the world. And it should be lauded for that in many, many ways. It has liberated so many places. And in reality, right at present, the world is in an unbelievably economically wealthy condition. No matter what anybody says, the world has never been this wealthy before, economically wealthy. There are pains and aches that goes with that. But nevertheless, the conditions that most of us live in today are amazing in contrast with 100 years ago. For example, John D. Rockefeller, the wealthiest man in the world in the 1930s, would have been living in conditions that would be in our, at least Australian or American language, would be at a upper, lower class level. There wasn't electricity, there wasn't transportation other than the beginning of cars, but so on. There was no plumbing in the home that I live in right now that was built in the 1870s. There was no electric light. This was lit by gas lanterns and so on. So you go back to that era. Your average person, we may not recognize this, but we have incredible economic wealth. The set of resources we have, and so on. And then when you come through to technology and the internet and so on, virtually all knowledge, and I'm going to put that in quotes, but all that which we view as knowledge is readily accessible to the whole world. Those, at least, who are actually able to access the internet. Now, there are plenty of people who can't, but overall, that's phenomenal. So if I were to be writing, and I never will, a history of economics, I will say that I think it has been a profoundly liberating force. However, I think that there is a huge price that we've begun to pay for that. And that is that we did seek a long time ago to get rid of slavery. But I actually think that most of us have become enslaved to the economic system. Almost every day we go to work, and the tasks we engage in are focused upon basically feeding the beast. Can we generate enough money to actually sustain the organizations and so on? And while there is a profoundly impactful notion of the multiplier effect in terms of economics, and of course the word capitalism, by the way, comes from the head of a cow. So pardon to anybody who might have vegetarian impulses, which I do. I've been a vegetarian now for 45 years. But capitalism comes from the notion of the head of the cow. And the idea of having a cow is that you can actually, first of all, milk it and get the liquid that is self-sustaining. It can actually be slaughtered, so it can be eaten. You can actually take the hide of the cow and make shoes, and then those shoes can enable us to walk 1,000 miles and someday maybe sit under the shade of a tree and receive enlightenment. So that's the idea of the multiplier effect. And while I think that that's an interesting one, I would prefer nature's way of thinking about multiplier, because I think it's got its own inherent way. It's quite different from what's capitalism's multiplier effect. So if you give me a plum, I've got some food that I can eat, but inside that, the seed can be planted, and a few years, it will give off thousands of plums, which many creatures can feed off. And so planting a tree or receiving a piece of fruit actually can be planted, the seed can be planted, and on we go. So I far prefer nature's way of the multiplier effect. And I think that in many ways, we've deviated in economic multiplier effect so profoundly from nature's way that we now are almost in a place where economic principles and ecological principles are in contradiction with each other. They're fighting with each other. And we're paying a huge price. Now, I want to talk a little bit about wealth creation. While the world is unbelievably wealthy, and I think the last generation has got to be praised for their great achievements in this, we're doing very, very poorly in terms of wealth distribution. And therein lies the rub. If you look at the wealth distribution systems we have at present, there are only really four. First of all, there's the jobs. If you've got a job, you usually get a piece of the economic pie. So that's one way wealth gets distributed. Another way is actually through government. It invariably provides services like building roads and so on. And so people can get jobs through government. But of course, the government actually only gets money from the people who make the money, the businesses and so on. So there are government distributions. There are welfare distributions, and they're very major. Even this moment in the world, everybody's trying to figure out how to provide economic resources to those who are going to be unemployed or underemployed in this particular period. And then the fourth one is crime. Those are the four biggies. Some people say philanthropy, but that's like a pimple on the back of an elephant. It's very, very small. And all four of these in this era are shrinking. Most jobs can be done by artificial intelligence and robotics. Nobody is arguing for larger government. People don't in general think that more welfare is good. It'd be better off having people being engaged in doing something which would be value add for society. And nobody's actually advocating for more crime. So I think, and I say it to my students over and over again, that the challenge for this next generation is to invent some brand new wealth distribution systems. There have been many that have been discussed in history, but none of them have really taken root to date. And often they get stigmatized by this false dichotomy between socialism and capitalism. But the reality is that we now face a gigantic challenge around how do we engage in wealth distribution. Now, one of the dilemmas, I think, with respect to economics in particular, is that it does not have a reliable and standard measuring rod. So for example, if we're talking about a mile long or a kilometer, we all know that that's pretty much fixed. If you're measuring it, you may be off by a fraction of an inch or a millimeter or so, but that is fixed. But what is the measuring rod with respect to economics? Now, this is pretty much bizarre because right at the moment, it's the American dollar. But that measuring rod is being sold and bought constantly. So it can vary from one day to the next. If you go back to Adam Smith, who was the person who was writing about this at the very beginning, he invented the measuring rod, and it was an interesting proposition. It was the price of corn in Scotland. That was the measuring rod. That was the base, and everything else is variable around that. And the reason it was the price of corn in Scotland was it was the thing that he found to be the absolute most stable. Of course, across time that changed and so on. We get to the gold standard, that then you buy and sell the gold, and then that becomes variable. And lo and behold, maybe we should use the silver. So you buy and sell silver, and then you use the silver to buy the gold, and the gold to buy the silver, and so on. And we're in this very, 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 very crazy making situation where something like one nation or the World Bank or the United States can decide to float its economy and gain something across one particular evening, and it'll wipe out the economy of some country in Central America or something like that. And things like this are actually deeply, deeply, deeply troubling in economics. So there are some big challenges ahead with respect to this. I want to actually, however, bring you to another perspective, and that is that when most of us talk about wealth, we actually think about economics. But economic wealth rests upon a lot of other wealth. I've been working with senior executives for a very long time, and I don't recall exactly when this was. It was at least 20 years ago. Had a whole crew of folk at the Wharton Business School in an executive program, probably 50 or 80 people were there. And we were trying to have a serious conversation about the things I've just been talking about right now. And we asked these international executives, and they were probably from about 20 different countries, to list the set of wealths that they think economic wealth rests upon. And these were the ones they came up with. First of all, there's no particular hierarchy of this, but these were the ones that they said. All financial wealth rests upon emotional wealth, distributional wealth, ethical wealth, relational wealth, leadership wealth, identity wealth, physical or health wealth, intellectual wealth, informational wealth, social wealth, wealth of influence, wealth of amicability, green or environmental wealth. And then when all of those are in place, you actually had economic wealth. I want to say, be very clear, this was not something or other that scholars put together. It wasn't something or other I put together. This was when asked this question, this is what they came up with. They missed a big one, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But I think that it's really fascinating to recognize that when economics starts talking about its metrics like return on investment or shareholder value or market share or any of these kind of metrics, they don't calculate all of these things. These are subtext in virtually all of those things. And I think that those sets of metrics are just really profoundly limiting. I now, in most settings, ask people before we even talk about economics to actually discuss what their view is their own economic wealth or the distributional wealth, each of these wealths, and put a number between 1 and 10 or whatever. And it's really quite fascinating to see that very often people with low economic wealth have a lot more other wealths. And intriguingly enough, as a consequence of that, many of the economic things that happen in businesses are resting upon the other kinds of wealth that other people are carrying, but it's never being monetized for or with them. And I think that that is one of the things that would be really worthwhile challenging ourselves around in terms of what are we going to do with economics actually in the future. Now, the one that is problematic is that no economic system operates successfully without a body of coherent law. And in most cases, coherent law has only really been developed by nation states. So you can look at American law or British law or German law or Australian law. Those legal systems actually undergird the economic system of that nation. We started with globalization seriously about 3 or 4 decades ago, but to date, there has been the development of no global law. There are international laws like you can fish here, or these are the waters that you can't bring your submarines into. There are transactional laws like that that are international and usually bilateral or multilateral. But to date, there is no body of global law. What we've actually done is we've turned and used economics as being the infrastructure for globalization. And it's fragile. And the reason why it's fragile is that there is no body of global law. And frankly, there are very few scholars in the world who are actually working on this. The majority of people are still pretty much locked in their own versions of nationalism. This, I think, is a serious challenge. And that I think that we're going to see that many of the dilemmas that lead to wars and so on continue until such time as that body of global law is actually written. But in order to do that, there needs to be some version of global governance. And of course, that's been problematic. We tried with the League of Nations, we've tried with the United Nations. So it can't be in institutions of those particular kinds, but it is going to require the development of some different kind of institutional infrastructure in order to generate a body of global law upon which economics can actually rest. Intriguingly, I think that that will be achieved as a byproduct of these other wealths. I think these other wealths are in the process of being built. And even in this particular moment we're in right now, the sharing of information, the extent to which, even though there are some competitive dynamics, there are people collaborating right across the world around this particular virus. And I think it's truly heartening. I'll give you my example. I'm receiving emails from former students in China who are saying, we don't need all these things anymore. We can send them to you. Give us your address and we'll send them to you. So I think that the possibilities of new versions of distribution in the midst of a crisis like this is really pretty profound. Now, I'm mindful, you've been telling me, Sally, that just in the last day or two, the Australian government has been doing some economic things. The same is beginning to happen in the United States and so on. And if perchance we could use a crisis like this to totally rethink who should be rewarded economically for what, I think would be unbelievably valuable. I did a couple of weeks ago, in talking to some of you who may have been present, discuss the whole issue of who gets paid what and who generates the resources. The reality is the only people in organizations that generate resources are the workers. That's the only people. The managers and executives are all completely dependent upon the workers generating. The wealth is created by the workforce. So why then is it that the workforce gets paid so little? And why is it those who can sit in their Ivy Towers and play with the computers and play Russian roulette with other people's money on the stock exchange, why are those the people that should get the small fortune? I happen to work in a university, and this is no criticism of the University of Pennsylvania particularly, but we have a president whose salary is $4 million. Do we have janitors who maybe earn $25,000 a year? Maybe. And yet, who are making the most significant contributions to our well-being every day? Namely, the janitorial staff. They're making much more contribution than the faculty are, and so on. So I think that there is a complete inverted hierarchy with respect to economic rewards. And if you would bore deeply into the core of this, we'd recognize that the distributions that have developed across recent time, where the haves are becoming so have, and the have-nots are becoming so have-not-ish, is seriously problematic. But even more problematic, and this is an organizational comment I'm making, is that the middle is disappearing. And in every human system where you have a two-party system, above and above, haves and have-nots, and without a buffer group in between, an integrating group, are highly unstable. So that there are certain things organizationally I think are really important for us to pay attention to. So I want to just say a couple more things about economics with respect to the kind of organizations we work in. To date, we pretty much refer to three sectors: the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector. Of course, the private sector is the one that run businesses, and they are the ones that generate the economic wealth. Government is completely dependent upon them, of course, and they usually get it through taxation, although sometimes they can generate resources by doing things like building roads. So these are little businesses that exist within government. And the social sector, of course, is addressing all the things that businesses and government will not do. Now, the sadness about this is that whatever government cannot or will not do, and whatever businesses cannot or will not do, they all cascade into the social sector, the NGO, civil society, nonprofit world. But they're the biggies. They're the pandemics. They're the illiteracy. They're the issues of distribution of wealth. All of the biggies cascade into the nonprofit sector or the civil society sector. Now, over and over and over again, I hear people say, if only government would run their government like a business, everything will be fine. Well, if only NGOs or nonprofits would run their enterprise like a business, everything would be fine. But that's a failure to recognize that those three sectors have totally different missions. The mission for a business, among other things, to do things that are value added to society. While that is absolutely essential, that generates the resources. And that is imperative, and none of us want not to be able to do that. It's a beautiful exchange where you can buy a bag of carrots for a particular amount of money, and you can help somebody build their hut, and they give you some money. I mean, it's a brilliant, it's a genius kind of a system. However, that isn't what government exists for. Government exists for preparing or taking care of the common good. And the common good is invariably defined by what there's a political mandate for. And then, of course, in the nonprofit sector, they are completely dependent upon others, a la government giving them money because there's a government enterprise which they'd like to be run by like a nonprofit, or partnerships with the private sector, or of course, philanthropy. But in a way, a nonprofit exists primarily for the purpose of getting out of the business. You need to get into the business, address the issue, and then get out of it. And if it needs to be maintained across time, it would be worthwhile figuring out a way to monetize it or to get government support for it. So the nonprofit world, where people are trying to develop careers in it, it's a really counterproductive kind of an idea unless we're going to institutionalize those and have them be going forever. Unfortunately, I think many of them become so institutionalized that they never really complete the work they need to do. And if you were to see for example, the extent to the mental health industry these days, it is just overwhelming. The amount of the mental health industry is one of the economic pillars of a society, so that if you were to solve all the mental health problems that we have, then one of those pillars would be fragmented and probably would create some kind of catastrophe. Now, I've spent a fair amount of time in the nonprofit world. I did, by the way, when I was teaching at Melbourne University, I was working in the business school. And when I left there, I went to a psychology department in the United States in a state university. And then I came to the University of Pennsylvania and first worked at Wharton. But I found that I was quite dissatisfied with the ways in which business was dealing with this. So I decided to cascade into the nonprofit world. And my easiest way to talk about this is to speak about this organization called MANA, which I've mentioned a couple of times, a Metropolitan AIDS Neighborhood Nutrition Alliance, which is a service for people living with AIDS who were dying of malnutrition in the early days. It is now morphed into providing nutritional support for people of all illness disease categories, cancers and diabetes and so on. But the thing that struck me about this work was that the worst thing you can do in a nonprofit is chase the money. I see organizations over and over again seeking the money and then trying to figure out what they're going to do with the money. I think that we're far better off ignoring the money to begin with and to pursue the actual purpose of what a nonprofit is about. And if it is generating value, the resources will come. I want to just tell you a brief story about MANA. We discovered really early on that the majority of the food which we prepare does not nourish the body. It certainly doesn't nourish the bodies of people who are ill with malnutrition, the wasting syndrome, where the body is beginning to eat itself. That was what was happening with final stages of the majority of people who were dying of AIDS. They weren't dying of a disease. They were dying of malnutrition because no food that they were eating was actually sustaining their body anymore. We needed a very different theory of nutrition in order to reverse that. And we were actually the people, with a lot of help of many, many others, to actually crack the nutrition with respect to the wasting syndrome. And it was amazing to recognize that you can stack all 22 proteins in a little brownie, just one tiny little piece of food. I remember going one day into the building, I hadn't eaten a single thing, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I grabbed a brownie and I shoved it in my mouth with one gulp. And within no time, my body was just going freaking out. I mean, they were scraping me off the ceiling because that infusion of protein in my body and that one blast, without anything else, my body couldn't actually take it. So here's the rub. And frankly, I've experienced this as profoundly significant. The majority of us do not need to eat a fraction of what we eat. It is possible if we have the right nutrition tailored for our body, and that means sometimes it's high caloric, sometimes it's high protein, sometimes various things. We need to be sure we have more liquids in us and so on. We have figured out that humans only need to eat 1/5 of what we eat in order to sustain us. Now, those of us who like to snack on something sugary, like a cookie in the afternoon, that gives us, of course, a sugar high, that then we need another cookie because we've now got a sugar high. For every cookie you take, you got to drink 2 glasses of water to counteract the sugar impact. This is what I discovered for myself a long time ago. I came to realize that if I am feeling hungry, I'm not hungry at all. That's a false feeling. I'm dehydrated. So every time I feel hungry, drink 2 glasses of water and the hunger disappears. And it is amazing to me how many people I encounter who walk around who are highly dehydrated, but not knowing that we actually proceed to eat more. Now just think, we've got 7.5 billion people on the planet, going to be another 500 million within a few years. And can we feed all that population? The answer is yes, we can. On current agriculture and current diet, we can feed 12 billion. However, the problem is not, can we create the food? The problem is, can we distribute it? And therein lies the rub. It's the same issue as the economic distribution. How do we distribute food? And I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes' time. But I wanted to tell you this one thing about the multiplier effect. We started Manna, 7 people, with a commitment that we would ensure that no person living with HIV in the greater Philadelphia area would ever go hungry again. That was our commitment. We had $4,000. That $4,000 would have disappeared within probably a week and a half. The first month, our expenses were at least $20,000. We were just amazed when we started doing this, how many people wanted to help. I mean, we started with 7 people, and how many people needed help. In no time, we realized we're just taking casseroles out into the street and finding people with HIV, imagining that we were actually getting HIV while we're giving the food to these folks, because we knew nothing about this whatsoever. But here's the story. I'm going to just lay it all out. Completely a volunteer-run organization. There are staff members whose job it is to manage the volunteers. But all the labor is done by the volunteers. And within a year or so, we have had 1,000 volunteers working a week. We were distributing masses and masses of food. And we did eventually, when we managed to get our head around the nutritional issues. By the time we had delivered our 5 millionth meal, in the dollar terms, that would have been about the equivalent if you walked into a cafeteria and you pay $10 for a meal. So 5 million meals contributed $50 million of gifted food. What did it cost us? It cost us $25 million. So in that time, we raised $25 million. We fed people 5 million meals, and nobody paid anything for it. It was gifted, and so on. But the real multiplier was that for every day we could keep a person out of the hospital, and with proper nutrition, we were keeping people out of the hospital for much longer time periods, we saved significant money. My calculations were that it was over $220 million. I never wanted to be accused of exaggerating, so I reduced it down to 100 million. So here's the multiplier effect. Investment of 25 million, served 5 million meals at a value in the society of 50 million, and saved 100 million. Starts with $4,000. That's it. People were captivated by the mission, were captivated, and it was just mind-boggling where that money came from. At a certain point, I would pull it out of my drawer, except that this room's about to be painted and I've shifted all my stuff over here. But Sarah and I made a decision that we'd take out a home equity loan on our house because we thought, yeah, the month is going to come where we're going to be $20,000, $50,000 in the hole. The only amount we had at the time was $80,000. So we took out a home equity loan for $80,000. And I had a book of 25 checks. I never wrote a single check. I've kept that book. This goes into the 1990s. I've kept that book just simply as a symbol of the fact that somehow or other, every day, every week, every month, every year, we had what we needed. We didn't have what we wanted, but we had what we needed. And almost every day, we were living on an economic precipice, almost every day. I'll say some more about that later on. So let me now move to the issue of the environment. That's my commentary on economics. And I think that if we could start picking up any of those threads, I think it would be really worthwhile, not least of which would be to think seriously about how we manage food. Now to the issue of environment. Clearly, the most important thing that happens every day on the planet is the creation of food. Nothing else parallels it in terms of its importance. However, there is the creation of the food and there's the distribution of the food. And both of those two things are highly dependent upon water and highly dependent upon energy. You've all read the introduction to my book. I think that it's pretty clear that the water problem can be solved the energy problem can be solved. Those can both return to the place of being freely available to everybody. Back into the diamond water paradox, I think that water can be free because energy can be close to free in a matter of time. That's going to require huge industrial shifts, but I think probably maybe not in my lifetime, but I think in our children's lifetime, we will see this shift occur, and I think it'll work fine. But the thing that I'm struck by is the following. I just want to just tell you this. I don't know why. I guess it's a maternal instinct. Most mothers would say this, but as a father, I don't think I ever recognized it. When we started with Manna, the meals that we deliver would be in the middle of the day. And probably within 2 or 3 weeks of doing that, I experienced myself as unable to eat anything until I knew that everybody in Philadelphia who needed food was fed with HIV. So my first meal of the day would usually take place somewhere about 1 or 2 o'clock. I thought that was going to be taxing, but it wasn't. I think the emotional vitality that work brought along enabled us, and me in particular, just to not even think about food. And a couple of times I tried to put some food in my mouth before that, and I just couldn't even digest it. And I did that for about 20 years. And I'm touched by the realization that when I did start eating again earlier in the day, I chose to eat a bowl of cereal. So nowadays I eat 2 meals a day, one at about 11 o'clock if I'm free to do this, and I have a bowl of cereal and then an evening meal with family and so on. But every time I eat that cereal, I'm struck by all the hands that labor in order to make that bowl of cereal. Usually I have some fruit there too. You think of the people who plow the land, plant the seed, harvest it, put it onto bags, put it onto trucks, the people who drive the trucks, that go on roads, the people who drove the roads, the people who provided the fuel for the tractors. And like that bowl of cereal that might cost me from buying in the supermarket $1 or $1.50. Oh, and then there's the milk, the characters who milk the cows and so on. And how that probably hundreds of hands labored for me to have that bowl of cereal. And that's true of every single one of us, that we are dependent upon hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people every single day for the food we put in our mouth. Do we have awareness of that? And are we grateful for that? Do we think of these people in a kindly way, or do we think of them in some kind of adversarial way? So when the price of bread goes up by 10 cents, do we shudder? What are they doing now? And then you think of all these middle people who are enabling it to come to market and so on. All those hands that are laboring. And in a way, I think there's only one way to characterize this and say, the highest priority for the world is the rural sector, those that are doing the farming. Now, of course, we start running into a whole bunch of problems. How many crops can you get in a particular year? What do you do with pesticides and so on? And because of the economic pressures, then of course, we're going to be trying to produce as many crop rotations per year or outputs and so on. But if we were to start thinking seriously about the fact that our needs are only a fraction of what they are, that could also be reversed. So one of the invitations I extend to you and to anybody who is in my universe, it would be, let's think seriously about eating less. And that means we've got to get rid of some of the things like our addictions to things like sugar, which has been highly planted in us for economic reasons going way back into history. And that to replace that hunger pang just with water. Now, I just want you to, going back to Manna just for a moment. When we started in all of that, we knew that they were going to be dealing with drugs that would ultimately perhaps make a difference. And it took about 15 years before those protease inhibitors really took root. But we did know, and we knew it very well, that those protease inhibitors did not work effectively unless the people had the right nutrition in their bodies. And often that meant they needed to eat something about every hour, like a little snack every hour or so. And that meant radical shifts in diet. We were trying desperately to get the pharmaceutical companies to start bonding with us for the purpose of making sure that medicine and nutrition be developed together. It was a long, hard road. But I want to tell you that now Manna has 3 insurance companies that actually write scripts for nutrition. So if you go to the doctor and they think that better nutrition is going to be more healthy for you rather than taking these particular medications, they will prescribe particular versions of food. And this has been established by the New England Journal of Medicine did a set of studies on our behalf to show that the parallelisms between how much more healing takes place if medicine is joined with the right nutrition. And I offer that to you as part of the story. Now, with respect to the environment, I think we all know this, and I'm not going to pontificate about the environment, but we are really in deep, deep trouble around biodiversity. I must admit, when I went to Australia, I was concerned lest those glorious rainforests up in North Queensland would have been obliterated. We went up to Cairns, and because we've got family up there, and I was just filled with joy to see that they were not. And just the richness of that biodiversity in that northern part of Queensland on the coast is just phenomenal. But our biodiversity is going down, and that cannot continue. And in many ways, I think that biodiversity with respect to nature is also the same thing as with respect to organizations, that we are seeking homogenization of things that need to be preserved in much more diverse kinds of forms. And I'll say a little bit about that a little bit later. But if you think about groups, once upon a time, it was very easy to create groups. We just found our common base, and that was it. Groups were forged based upon our commonness. That meant we all thought the same way. That meant that we all had a common way of understanding things, and we were losing the diversity that would be potentially available to us. Nowadays, I think that an effective group has to be built upon its diversity. In other words, its differentnesses and its inherent conflicts, which often makes us feel lost because we don't feel we belong there. Let me move very quickly from there through to now the issue of humanity. So let me just go very quickly into this. When I find myself in the place that I've been in this last week, I usually turn to 4 or 5 authors that I've read many, many times: Heidegger, Paul Tillich, Rollo May, Otto Rank, Robert Johnson. And I particularly grabbed a book by Tillich called On the Boundary. And I thought, I seem to be a person who's on the boundary. Let me see if I can start listing off some of those boundaries that I live on. His was on between 2 temperaments, between city and country, between social class, reality and imagination, theory and practice. These were the ones he came up. And I sat at 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning one day with a piece of paper, and I started listing off the boundaries. I stopped after I wrote down 60 sets of boundaries, but I'll just highlight just a handful of them. East and West, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I grew up in China before I came to Australia. So Mandarin was my first language, and English I spoke as a kid was only with Canadians, lived in the neighborhood, and then my family escaped the revolution of '49. So East and West within me. I had an English mother and an Australian father, so I have the colonized and the colonizer in me. And then when I think about Caucasians being in Australia and the indigenous peoples, we too are colonizers. So the colonized and the colonizer, introversion and extroversion, haves, have-nots, art and science, what is, what could be, digital thinking versus analogic thinking, the banal and the divine, doubt and faith, doing and being, eternal, the ephemeral, abilities, disabilities. These are examples of it. And then it struck me, no, you're not talking about being on the boundaries. You're talking about unifying or integrating polarities. And that's the place I would like to go. But I want to just simply say that I think that one of the greatest gifts that has been ever given to us human beings are the things that we view as being polarities that seem to be contradictions, but they are not contradictions. They are opposite sides of the same coin, and they manifest themselves in very different ways. And that the great challenge that we have psychologically and in groups and in organizations and nation states across political spectrums and all those things, the challenges that we have is to not view those polarizations as a burden, but as a gift. And there is a concept in Buddhism. By the way, I think the Buddha was the first great psychologist 2,400 years ago. He was writing the psychology that we use today. We think that psychology is more recent than that, but it was all there in Buddhism. But in that mindset of that particular era, that man was talking about the task of synchronizing dissonance. And a great deal of the suffering that we experience is as a direct byproduct of our inability to actually synchronize dissonance. In other words, hold the polarities close enough together, long enough, so that the energies that are latent in the connectedness, it's like electricity. If you hold these electrons together close enough, you repel and so on, but if you hold them close enough, you get electricity. I think the same is right there in those polarities that we have. The dilemma we face is that we do not have very good vocabulary or even concepts for understanding what the unifying force is in the synchronization of it. I'm going to pause on this. Many of you know I run Power Labs. Some of you have read some of that literature where I take some people off to be elites and they run the society, and I take people off to be outs and they're the have-nots. They get next to nothing. These get a lot, and I get some people in the middle. Now, it's really interesting. Before I send folk into one of these, I often ask them, what would you like to do? What would you like to be? Nobody wants to be in the middle. Everyone wants to either be an elite or an out. When I ask them, why do you want to be an elite? Their response is usually something like, I want to know what it's like to have absolute power. What an unbelievable illusion that actually being in a, quote, an elite position actually gives you absolute power. But that's the way to think about it. You ask the other people, why do you want to be outs? They say, all my life I want to run a revolution. And I've never been brave enough to do it. So I want to be an out, and I want to rip this society down. So it's really interesting to actually see how these things play out. And I've been doing this now for, goodness, the first one of these I ran 46 years ago. I've been running them for a very long time. And what I've come to recognize, and this is where I'm going to pause, is that there is profound play in the power lab structure itself between the elites, the outs, and the middles. If the middles get aligned with the outs, the revolution is on. If the middles get aligned with the elites, the downtroddenness increases. If the middles will just stay in the middle and work on trying to connect the polarities, they get torn asunder and get shredded to pieces. And they hate it, hate it, hate it. And afterwards they say, I never want to be a middle ever again. So those who are in middle management probably would be able to identify with this without difficulty at all. However, what became fascinating to me was to realize that even within the elite group, there were upper middles and lowers. And even within the out group, there were upper middles and lowers. And within the middle group, there are upper middles and lowers. In other words, it was a replica. And if you just trifurcate it, shove the elites off here, the outs off here, and the middles off there, they will have their own power lab in their own group. And so when we're studying these things, we're not just studying the one generic power lab at the systemic level, we're studying the generic power lab and the power lab within each of these respective groups. And then here's the rub. Every human being is experiencing a power lab. But they too have a part of themselves, which is what I've chosen to call, and those of you who've read Yearning for Home in Troubled Times would know this, what I would refer to as the creative self. We all have a creative self. And we all have a suffering self. And it is very hard for us to integrate the creative self and the suffering self. More about that afterwards. But I want to just point out that as we begin to study and work with the tensions about our creative self and our suffering self, we invariably feel broken. And in our brokenness, we crave desperately to return to the condition we were in before we got broken. However, if we can embrace the brokenness, we discover that is actually the birthing of a new way of being. It's like a chick breaking out of an egg. And unless we're willing to actually embrace our brokenness, like our society, like our world at present is broken, how do we hold ourselves accountable to this? Unless we're prepared to accept the beauty and the potency and the regenerativeness that is residing in our brokenness, we'll return back to the condition we were in previously to try to prevent ourselves from getting broken again, and only end up locking ourselves in to the same dilemmas that we've been having all along. There's a long history of appreciating that people bond together in crises and will share in every conceivable way. And then as soon as everything's become normative again, then people retreat back to the space in which they had been previously. And so you're really living with that anxiety that that's going to be the case. I think one of the other problems is that we can't really maintain 1,000 meaningful relationships or 1 million reasonable relationships. We are kind of a tribal people. The majority of us probably have networks that of friends that probably 150 or something like that. So the issue of scale, I think, is really important and really big. But I don't know how to even think about this separate from the propensity that we all have to, the language I use is to otherize. So we view other as other. And the moment we've otherized them, they otherize us. And so we play a game of otherizing backwards and forwards. And it's often part of the mirroring process. Well, they're better than us, or they're worse than us, or we're more intelligent than them, or I can run faster than you, whatever it is, that just the whole competitive sort of thing. And the tendency to want to use other people for self-comparison processes, I think is a fairly major psychological challenge for all of us. I think the extent to which we are asked by society to be something other than what we are is profound. And I think this would be one of the things that I would have high on the Gandhi list of decolonizing. And that is, there only is one Helen. There only is one Sally, ever in the history of the world. Complete, unequivocally unique. And Sally has to figure out, and Helen has to figure out exactly what they're going to give to the world from their capacity. Well, you think of all the times that all the energy we pour into figuring out how we stack up against others or with others. So the moment we started getting into this otherizing game, the moment we've otherized somebody else, we've actually otherized ourselves. And I think that's a deep sinkhole. So if there were a psychological journey for humanity to take, that's one of them, to recognize that actually otherizing is an attack on the self. It's a stabbing at the self. And I can't even begin to say enough about this issue of the unbelievable gift that each of us represents as a unique human being. Often I find students say, just, I don't want to be selfish. I'm a little afraid that people will think I'm greedy or I'm being selfish. And my response to that is, oh, no, no, no. Be as selfish as you possibly can be. Well, let me just change that a little bit. How about you become self-full? How about you become completely full of yourself? How about you get to the stage where you're so full of yourself that you notice that yourself is actually got a capital S. It's not a small s, it's got a capital S. That you've been gifted so much that you just can't help it. You'll give it away. I mean, that's what I say to students over and over and over again. Become more self-full until you just have so much in you, it just bubbles out of you. And now as it bubbles out of you, make sure it's pure gold. You've got refining methods to make sure that what bubbles out of you is not the garbage, it's the gifts. So this is the way psychologically, I think that's the nature of the journey. But to come back to the way you pose the question, how do we hold ourselves accountable to this? I think that you can't build institutions to make that accountability. That has to come from some place within. And one of the things I would say about that place within is that to figure out the nature of our own personal moral rudder. And I think that's another psychological / spiritual journey that we all need to go on, where we know when to hold the rudder firm, let it be loose and so on. And so I can't in any way prognosticate around this particular case, but what we're in at present, how it will all play out. But I do think that what I've just been talking about is part of the psychic journey. And I think that requires a lot of dumping of these hero myths or this notion that we've all got to be the same or we've got to be all spectacular. I mean, your average student at Penn are all trying to do startups while they're undergraduates, and their startup is an app. And they all want to be famous within 6 months. And if they're not famous within 6 months, they're depressed. And they come and say, what's wrong with me that I can't have impact immediately? Well, sometimes impact requires generations to have. So I think our generation needs to be more mentoring of these folk about calm down, and they're filled with such aspirations and expectations and so on. Now, they're very, very bright, but they need help. And so people like us, I think, have to step into that void and help guide them. They're desperate for guidance. But what I notice is thrilling in a way. They want to have nothing to do with people like me. Nothing to do with people like me. And they want my attention all the time. Both and. They want to push you away as hard as they possibly can and pull you as close. It's just that like adolescent pull push. Come close distantly, stay away closely. And they'll ding you for one reason or another and just smile at them and shrug your shoulders. And so I think that it requires a new kind of energy. I'm sure that's not satisfying to Cameron. It's not satisfying to me as it comes out of my mouth. But I do think that that's what's ahead.
The way we are so monetized economically, how do we change our relationship with money? There is more than enough if we each give enough.
Well, I think this is the time for us to be generous, frankly. I think the majority of us are storing money for the inevitable moments in our lives when we need money. And that's what we've been doing. This is one of those times where we need money. So now let's start spending it. And let's spend it judiciously. I think what most of us are going to do is exact opposite. We're going to say, no, since the world's going to fall apart, we better hang on to our resources so that when I get old, I'll be able to take care of myself and so on. So I think it's just a time for a call for people to be generous. And those of you who've been reading the book know what I think about this issue of generosity. That generosity has its refunds constantly. I'll give you an example from my life. I've had numerous jobs. There's only one occasion where I took a job where the salary was higher than the job I had before. With one exception, it was the time I went to Wharton. They seemed to have more money than most of the other places, so they gave me more cash than I expected. But that was the only time I took a job that gave me more money. But what I've discovered is the less I seek money, the more money I have. It's just stunned me in my lifetime that the less I seek after it, the more I seem to have. I think it's an interesting adage. I remember being a graduate student and having nothing. I was at Yale at the time, and I literally had nothing in the bank and not a penny in my pocket. And the moment I got to that state, I thought thoroughly differently than I had previously. But somebody or other who had a family car, an old beat up VW, he said, "Yeah, why don't you drive my beat up VW? I'm keeping it for my kids, and they're not at driving age yet." And it was really, really, really beat up car. And I said, "Well, thank you. That's really generous of you, but it looks like the kind of car that's going to die within the next week or two. And then I'll owe you a whole bunch of money for the car." He says, "Nah, just drive it and see what happens." I said, "Would you put a price on it for me, please?" He said, "Yeah, $100. Okay, if this car dies, you owe me $100. So sure enough, it died. And I came to him and I said, "I'm sorry," Bob was his name. "Sorry, Bob, but I don't have $100 at present to pay you back for the car." And he said, "I'm sure that sometime in your life, you will encounter somebody or other who needs something that you don't need, and you'll give it to them. And when you do that, you will have repaid me." I probably have given that $100 that Bob gave me away 1,000 times. Like the number of times that it's like somebody needs something or other, that I have excess, and just give it. I looked at him strangely. I was still pretty young. I was perhaps 28 or 27 maybe. And he said, "Isn't this what the brotherhood of mankind is? Brotherhood, sisterhood of mankind is? Isn't that what we want?" So my reaction to all of this is give away everything. Give away everything. Because if we all give away everything, whatever others are giving to us, it's just circulation. I didn't mention this previously about economics, but my view about economics is the following, is that all the metrics are wrong. And particularly, they're always going for amounts, like you've got to have quantity. Like, how much money is there? Or there's going to be $1 trillion when we do this, whatever. And it seems to me like money is sort of like the bloodstream of society. And if the blood doesn't get to your toe or your right ear, and it all goes just to one part of you, if in the society or the world it just goes to one part of you, then the rest of it atrophies, and then the whole is greatly impaired. So I actually think that the problem for most of us is the privatization of our possessions, the privatization of our ideas, the privatization of like almost everything. So my view about all this is, let's start just giving away what we got. What I'm mindful of is that every single day, energies come into me and energies go out of me. Every single day. It comes in via breath, it comes in via food, it comes in via love, it comes in via confrontation. Like energies are always coming in and energies are always going out. And what I was mentioning before, like 98% of the cells of our body reproducing themselves every year, like that, we're a veritable river of change all the time. So we are not a stable entity at all. We are always energy flows, always, always, always. And the majority of things that get us into trouble is when we block ourselves. And so we do things that block our energy flow. You would appreciate that a lot of the work that I do is with other people. I have a lot of folk who help me in my work. And we get into some terrible messes, unbelievable messes in organizations and classrooms and so on. goodness, some of the work the most challenging work I did in my life was with Apartheid in South Africa, and just like, unbelievable messes, complex beyond compare. And we have this one ground rule, just one. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel about anybody. You're allowed to think whatever you think about anybody. But you're not allowed to open your mouth until you have discovered the part of you that feels loving towards them. And only then may you speak. And then when you speak from a loving place, you can say whatever you like. Because it's not what you're saying that matters, it's the fact that you're doing it lovingly. That's my ground rule. And almost always, the transformation comes as a byproduct of like this little piece of loving coming from here, this little piece of loving coming from here, and then suddenly, boom, something shifts. I'll give you an example. I had a group of folk from, I think it was Malaysia. They were at some program. Their organization was in there. The top executives of this organization, total mess. And I got this job of diagnosing it and trying to help them through this mess. And we start off in a first minor way, and then we get build. No time you're dealing with the seriousness of it all. Well, after about an hour or two, there was the ugliest thing I would see, like just awful. And they were really volatile, all men actually, and all Muslims. I began to feel like I'm completely out of control. I have no idea what to do with these people. It's only a matter of minutes before they're going to go off on break for prayers and so on. I thought, I should call the fire brigade and hose them down. I don't know what to do with them. They went off and they came back totally different human beings. I just watched them work their tails off. And at the end of the day, I said, what was this all about? And what they said, and it was like, it just touched me in the deepest place. What they said is, we knew we had to get out all our garbage before we went to prayers. So that's what we did. We spewed all over each other. And then we went to prayers. And now, having done all that spewing, we're actually able to release it in our collective prayers. And we came back and we decided we wanted to heal it. That's an example of a day where I thought I did nothing of value, nothing at all. At the end of them, they're hugging me. They say, you're the best professor we've ever encountered. You're really miraculous. And I was looking like, I didn't do nothing. And that what they said was, yes, you did. You held a space for us. I think the issue is, are we capable and willing to give of our most precious gift, namely love? And it doesn't matter what form you give it, so long as you give it lovingly. And that was actually our ground rule with respect to manna. We would say, do not cut these carrots angry. I want to talk about truth. And I want to talk about trust. And I want to talk about faith. And I want to talk about belief. And I want to talk about them in not as though these are somehow or other belonging to the domains of theology, religion, or anything like that. I think it's been a travesty that things like faith, trust, and belief and truth have been sequestered by religious institutions across the time as though it was their province. But if you just pause and ask ourselves the question, do we trust? And what does it take to trust? Are we willing to acknowledge how much we are sustained by trust every moment? For example, when I go to the doctor, do I trust the doctor to treat me in the best way possible? When I go to the grocery store, do I test the food to see whether it's going to poison me, or do I trust that it's going to be fine? When I get on a bus, I trust that the bus driver will take me where I want to go. Human beings are unbelievably trusting beings. That's true even at the cellular level. Like these cells that were in my body yesterday and are gone today, they've communicated with these new cells that have shown up, and the new cells trusting the communication that passed on to them, like at the cellular level. Biology is trusting itself all the time. So that this question of whether others are trustworthy, I think that the issue is, if we trust is in and of itself a contagious force. So I have a couple of people where I basically says, my bank account's your bank account. Your bank account's my bank account. If you ever need to take money out of it, just do it. I trust you. I mean, you can do that within a family, that's sort of easy, but to do it across family lines, I think that's also sort of interesting. This era, this particular time where we were sort of like struggling with what are facts and what are truths and so on, is very complicated. And I want to tell you a story that moved me deeply. It was only a couple of years ago, and we were in a group dynamics session, and a student, she was a Wharton MBA student from India, and she went into a very quiet, semi-depressive base. And then suddenly she burst forward and she says, I don't know, I got to tell you my problem with myself. I don't think I know what my truths are. I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, I'll give you an example. I had a trauma when I was young, and I didn't know how to understand it. So I tried to tell people about it, but they didn't understand and they didn't listen. So I developed a different story, and I told it to people, but they didn't understand it or didn't listen. And I kept doing that until such a time as I actually told a story that other people paid attention to. Now, I know, going back, I know that I had this event, and I told myself 5 stories across time. But bit by bit, I began to forget the ones that actually nobody responded to or that nobody understood. So that now I have a narrative of what that trauma was. And I don't think it's a true representation of it. The representation of that trauma is being socially constructed by the way people responded to how I told the story. And I can no longer remember what the original stories were. The only one I can remember is the story that got reified in my exchanges with other people. I think that what she told, I mean, she just stunned a lot of us. She just blew us out of the water because she told it with a kind of authenticity that you just sort of say, is just because it's probably true of all of us. Are we being true to ourselves? And do we know what our internal truths are? And I'm just going to say it point blank. We have all eviscerated our capacities as human beings over and over and over again in order to fit into the social structures and to be accepted for whatever reasons, over and over and over again. And that there are still capacities in us that are just waiting to burst out. And I think part of this decolonization of the heart and of the spirit is to give ourselves permission to release those and to recognize that we can trust that the world around us will be able to learn from them. Just like that young lady, she just showed us the way. And then the other is Benjamin Franklin used to say over and over again, always remember that half a truth is a complete lie. A lot of people say, oh, I'm not lying, and assume that if we're not lying, we're actually telling the truth. And it's not the case. I mean, we cherry pick things and we don't represent the totality of it. And then we come to this issue of negative and negativism. And it's a mathematical problem that goes like this. If you're dealing with algebra, if you've got plus, multiply by plus, it gives you plus. And if you have minus, multiply by minus, you get plus. But not in the psychological domain. Listen to this. If I'm happy, I can negate my happiness and I'll be unhappy. But if I negate my unhappiness, that doesn't necessarily make me happy. It may well make me mega unhappy, depressed. And if I negate my depression, fight against my depression, it will actually make me really disturbed. So I think one of the problems that we have got into is that we think that if we negate something that we dislike, we're actually doing something worthwhile. And here's my favor about this. A lot of people think that justice is delivered when we fight against injustice. And fighting against injustice is a double negative. And the moment you've got a double negative, we've got into negativism. One of the schools I work in at Penn calls itself the Justice School. In the time I've been there, we've never been able to have a conversation about justice, ever. The only thing we're actually able to have a conversation about as a faculty are all the injustices around us and how we need to fight against them. Well, the actual fighting against them is like a false war. Then what we do is that we have the negativism so clearly locked into our mind and our being that we look at the world through our negativism, and therefore we've got to take on the fight even more. Mandela said this when he came out of jail after 27 years. He said, I didn't need to be in jail for 27 years, that I certainly needed to be in jail for a long time. Because when I went incarcerated there, I knew what I was against, but I never really knew what I was for. And I think that far too many of us know what we're against, but we haven't figured out what we are for. And the only thing worth putting energy behind is what we are for and what we're willing to create together. I'm going to try in the next 6 minutes to tell you a story. It's from Gita, part of a novel, which is at the heart of Hinduism. And the story goes something like this. There is a warrior who has been fighting in a battle for a very, very long time. And he is exhausted. He's done his duty, and he has been working for ages in this battle. And he has an imaginary conversation with his charioteer, who is actually an imaginary representation of one of the divine beings in Hinduism. And it goes like this. It says, please, can I just quit? I'm done. I'm exhausted. And this divine voice says to him, I'm not sure that that's really the path for you. And confronts him with the realization that there are two warring parties here who are actually representatives of his families. One which has been elevated to being virtuous, and one which has been labeled as villainous. And he's fighting on behalf of these against these. It isn't as though he is not prepared to kill. It's just that he recognizes that if I kill them, I'm killing myself. And if I'm killing them, I'm killing myself. And the divine voice says to him, if you leave this battlefield, you know what's going to happen. It will be a bloodbath. So your job is to stay right here, right in the middle of the conflict, because you are holding these two warring parties in a way that is actually stopping them from killing each other. And in the final analysis, you could construe that as being that he has engaged in splitting the parts of himself and projecting that he loves and appreciates and projects it into them, and the parts of the self which he hates or despises and projects it into them. His higher self and his lower self. And if perchance he's not prepared to stay in the middle between the higher self and the lower self, if he cannot find his own accepting self, that this is true part of him and this is truly part of him, then what ends up happening is the creative energies of the higher self generates so much constriction that it exports the anxiety associated with that into the lower self. And the lower self experiences much more suffering and blames the higher self for the very suffering. And so both the higher self and the lower self collapse towards the middle, and the middle is actually unable to hold the polarities. And that by staying in the middle between our higher self and our lower self, our nobility and our ignobility, staying in the middle and accepting that this is who we are, allows those polarities to increase. But, it requires that accepting self to tolerate a high degree of anxiety. I think that somewhere down the road in this decolonization process, we human beings are going to need to recognize that we displace far too much of ourselves onto others without recognizing how fully it is in ourselves, and that this unique configuration of your higher self and my higher self, this unique configuration of my lower self and your lower self, is a gift. And our job is to synchronize that dissonance.
And I'm just reminded of the beautiful words of that song that we started with about what happens in the ordinary moments and what we can find. And I think you've just given us a lovely encapsulation of what it is that we're looking for.
That's why I want to actually play it one more time. Think of this as being every day in these banal, simple moments. My higher self is looking for you. I'm here, I'm coming. And the lower self is looking for you. They are our best friends. All of them are our best friends. Every one of them are our best friends, including the anxiety associated with it. But thank you.
So join me in thanking Kenwyn for an amazing 4 hours that we've had together, for the very generous gift that he's given NIODA and our community, and hopefully the abundance of ideas and whatever other surprises will come from what we've discovered together. So thank you very much, Kenwyn. It's been an absolute pleasure for us.
Likewise, thank you. And please know that I am in every single way an Aussie to my bootstraps. I care about you all. Every critter on that land, I care about you all. And I'm sorry I can't be with you much more in life, but that is my life. So thank you. Fare thee well.
Fear and rejection. In a stranger's eyes, I see my reflection.